Yeah, all right. Welcome back to KM6LYW Radio, the show about amateur radio or ham radio with an emphasis on digital or data modes, moving information back and forth over amateur radio, trying to reimagine amateur radio in the information age, making it relevant and accessible. That's a lot of buzzwords. Hey, today we've got a new Raspberry Pi, the Raspberry Pi 4. I've been trying to get these for years. You know, you go online, you go out to Raspberry Pi Locator, and you just can't find them anywhere. But I lucked out and got a Raspberry Pi 4. We're going to open it, and we're going to compare it to the Raspberry Pi Zero, which is the Pi we always talk about on this channel. We're going to do that this time on KM6LYW Radio. There it is. Uh-huh. All right, that is the most requested song at any party ever at any time. I'll let you figure out that one if I played it correctly. All right, so hey, let's get to the unboxing. The Raspberry Pi 4. I've got it from Adafruit right here. Let's get to the unboxing. Swing, sparkle, sparkle. That's right. If you can get a Raspberry Pi, get it from Adafruit if you can. It's not just for the cool packaging, but boy, they're huge members of the community with open source software, really promoting the Raspberry Pi. So let me see if I can just cut into this. It's just arrived today. Oh yeah, it's been a long time. I cannot believe how long it's been since we messed with these. All right, let's see what we got in here. We've got the cool Adafruit case. And looks like we have a tape right there. Loving it. I think it's been a couple of years. You know, I've got one of these as a home automation thing. It's like a box within a box. All right, haven't seen that in a while. Raspberry Pi 4 computer, 4 gigabytes of RAM. You can get it up to 8 as well. Let's see if I can open this. Yeah, so there it is. No static bag. That's kind of interesting. Just to touch these grounding points first before you lick your fingers and touch any of the other contacts. Cool. There it is. Raspberry Pi 4. Loving it. From Adafruit. From RaspberryPiLocator.com. I don't know if there's anything else in here or not. Probably not. I think that's just it. And some documentation. And it is in desperate need of an SD card and an installation. Just to give you an idea, this is the Raspberry Pi Zero, also made out of unobtainium, and that's the Raspberry Pi 4. So, yeah, a lot more memory in that guy, and a bigger form factor, full-size ports, USB 3, quad-core processor. Of course, they both have quad-core processors. The big difference, in my opinion, is this has 4 gigabytes of RAM. This has 512, but when we're talking about the Digipie was designed to fit into 512 megabytes, especially the fact that we don't need to use a monitor. I can steal that memory and use it as a system RAM. So everything runs perfectly on the Pi Zero through the Pi 4. So I can't wait to get some testing done here. I want to see how fast these boot up, see how fast the apps go. This is kind of like the baseline that I still like. And this would be the huge Raspberry Pi 4. It's going to be overkill, but why not, right? I mean, we make big cars for a reason too. So Raspberry Pi 4. Haven't unboxed one of those in years. Okay, so the first thing I did is I went out to Amazon and got the Geekworm Raspberry Pi 4 11 millimeter embedded heatsink. I didn't want to use a fan. I don't know. I just don't like active cooling. I think if you want active cooling, just go get a PC, right? So this is more of a radiator. And it's working really well. I've done some tests here. I'm going to share with you some of the data with different workloads, what kind of temperatures we're getting. But I do like this heat sink from Geekworm. Wasn't very expensive at $7 US. So get a heat sink. And more importantly, don't use the little thermal pads they give you. See if you can get some thermal compound. If you're using this heat sink, it's going to screw on and get it nice and tight. It probably, just by using this versus nothing, you know, I'd probably drop the temperature 10 degrees centigrade. So this was a big deal. Arctic silver. I don't know if all thermal compounds are the same, but check that stuff out. So now that we've got a heat sink on this thing, because they just run too hot, I think, by themselves without the heat sink. The other thing I did, of course, was I went out to digipie.org and got the Digipie SD card image, which is available to the patrons of the channel. Thank you so much, guys. And I burned that. I went through the initialization screen on each one of those and initialized this Digipie and made it my own by putting in my call sign. And now all of these modes are available to me on the Digipie. In this case, we've got the Raspberry Pi Zero hooked up to the ICOM 705 over a USB cable. We've got the nifty little screens attached to both of them, the DigiPi software drives. And let's see if we can just do some simple performance tests. I mean, I have a bunch of performance data here, but I think it'd be good for you guys to see maybe just like WSJTX working on one. I think that's one of the tougher workloads for this thing. I do also think we need to talk about the specifications for each one of these to figure out which one's best to you. There's like 5 or 6 things you should really consider. That's price, performance, and power. Those are the 3 Ps. And then also consider heat and weight. The Raspberry Pi 4 is bigger than the Raspberry Pi Zero in just about every single category, including performance, memory, but it's also double to 3 times more heat, the weight, the power requirements, the performance. I'll let you decide which one's better. They both have quad-core processors. Also, the Raspberry Pi 4 is $55 versus the Raspberry Pi Zero2W wireless, and I'm not talking about the original Zero. I'm talking about the Raspberry 2 wireless, which is about $15. So again, the Pi 4 is bigger by 2 to 3 times in every conceivable way. So I know a lot of people, I don't care what this weighs, Craig. Well, if you're going on summits on the air or doing backpacking, you want something as small and simple, especially if you have a power budget. The Raspberry Pi 4 is going to consume 2 to 3 times more power than the Raspberry Pi Zero in virtually every test that I did. And of course, having the big heatsink and fan, that's going to add weight and even more of a power budget. But if you don't care about those things and you're just operating your shack at home, the Pi 4 is fantastic. I'll kind of cut to the chase here and say, if I'm summits on the air, I'm probably going to do the Raspberry Pi Zero. It's just convenient. Most of the stuff I'm doing is APRS stuff, and the APRS and packet and AX.25 workloads don't tax any of these. In fact, if you just want to do APRS or packet, don't get either of these. Get just the Raspberry Pi Zero, the original one. You can still get that one on, let me see if I can find it here, on raspberrypilocator.com. The original Pi Zero, not the 2 wireless, but the original Pi Zero, that does a packet workloads perfectly. But do not count on using JS8 call or WSJTX on the original Pi Zero. But do it on the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 wireless, and of course the Raspberry Pi 4 over here. So I, like a lot of you, went out to our Pi locator and just kept hitting reload, had the alerts. It's like, man, there's got to be a way to, find the Raspberry Pi. And one day it just hit. I was looking at it, and for about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, Adafruit had the Raspberry Pi 4 available. Went ahead and got that. Also, like a couple of days later, I went to, I think it was Pi Shop. They had the Raspberry Pi 3 Model A, which has a small memory footprint, available for $35. So these are showing up. I think my advice here is to check them out on Monday mornings in the United States time. Well, I don't know. It depends on your, where you shop. But the U.S. stores tend to have their stocks Monday morning. So check out rpilocator.com Monday morning if there is a Raspberry Pi that you need to get your hands on. So that's kind of how I got this. I really felt lucky. I'm kind of watching this, every other day probably for a couple of years. All right, so now that I got the DigiPi SD card in there initialized and the Raspberry Pi heatsink on there, I wanted to run some workloads. So the first thing, let's take a look at the Raspberry Pi Zero. This is going to be our baseline. So we've got DigiPi Zero2 wireless up here. And I'm going to go ahead and start WSJTX FT8 by pressing on right here. And you'll notice this goes into WSJTX FT8 mode. And then, of course, I click on the launch link down here to actually see what's being displayed. Okay, we are on 20 meters, but we are not on the right frequency. Let's switch it over to, 14074. We're on 14074. And we should start decoding. So from a performance perspective, most of the CPU cycles are happening during the decode cycle. So it's kind of like after the 15-second frame, how fast do you see all of the additional, stations popping up? Man, looks like we got a lot of noise too. I bet you it's my LED lights. That's gonna mess with it. So it's how long, see this decode, see how this is staying blue right here? That's really what you want to take a look at. So at the end of the cycle, which is right about now, and then it decodes a whole bunch of stations. Now you can just kind of see how fast these are popping up just to get an idea. You're watching them scroll by. I don't know if I can zoom this any bigger. I could probably go a little bigger, huh? I don't know. But that just gives you an idea. The faster these stations scroll by after a frame comes by, Generally, the better the performance. Now, these are both quad-core processors, and they have some idle time, but they really are working when they're doing those decodes. When you're transmitting, there's no processor or memory pressure at all there. So that's just to give you an idea. So they're coming in slowly, and yeah, I got a lot of interference, so I don't have any long lists. These LED lights are just killing my HF rig right now. But so there they are. You got an idea of how the Pi Zero works. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And I'm going to stop WSJTX on the Raspberry Pi Zero. Now let's move over to the big boy. What I want to do over here, if you guys can still hear me, is I got to switch the USB cable. All right, this USB cable is out for the Raspberry Pi Zero. Now let's plug in the Raspberry Pi 4, if I can get it right. All right, now the big boy is plugged into the ICOM 705. Let's see what he does now. I want to switch over to its web-based interface for DigiPi, and I'm going to start WSJTX there. And let's see what this guy does. He's saying WSJTX FT8 on his little display now, and gives us the little URL to go to so we can display it. So, all of these modes, all of these apps, everything's available via your web browser or your Wi-Fi tablet or your cell phone. We're not going to plug in monitors and keyboards here. I don't know. It's kind of last decade. We're just going to do this all over virtual. So let me click on WSJTX FT8 here, and we'll see what this looks like. So there it is running on it looks like it's running on our web browser. It's displaying on our web browser and running on the Raspberry Pi. So here we are on 20 meters again, and I'm really watching this decode button that kind of turns blue down here. After each frame, it's not going to be blue for very long because this Pi really is awesome. See, there it was. It just did some quick decodes. I'm not sure why it flashes there sometimes. So frame came through. And we didn't get any new decodes. Man, it is just trashed. You know what it is? It's the Raspberry Pi 4 is just trashing the HF frequencies. Let me switch. Actually, no, I just had a bad connection there. Dude, that was brutal. Wow, that was a bad antenna connection. Wild. Anyways, you can see it in the waterfall. I was like, man, it's just getting trashed with interference. Probably bad ground. Okay, now we can see those stations rolling in. Frame just ended. It's decoding or decoded. And you can see how fast these are rolling in. So just keep an eye on the left here. This is really where it's CPU bound. Let's keep going. Keep going. And here's the next frame coming up. You see how fast those scroll by? It's definitely faster. Is the Raspberry Pi Zero prohibitively slow compared to this? No, I don't think so. And from here we can click on a name and enable our transmitter. So yeah, we're transmitting right now on using the Raspberry Pi 4. So I don't know. Is it that much better? I don't think so. It's not worth the downsides, including expense and all of the criteria that we talked about. So speaking of criteria, we talked about price, performance, power, heat, weight. I kind of went out and measured all of these as the patrons. Thank you, patrons. And measured this stuff. So we got the Pi 4 over here on the left and the Pi Zero on the right. So first of all is price. The Pi Zero is going to be $15. That's retail. I know they're scalping it for a lot more, like over $100 on eBay. So $15 versus $55 retail prices for these guys. Okay, that's a big difference. But honestly, in this day and age, given the supply chain, if it's available, you buy it. Okay, I don't wait. Don't think about it. If you see Pi Zero2W wireless or Pi 4, just buy it. Just go ahead and buy it. I might also mention that I might like the Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, especially if it has a little more memory. It's kind of the sweet spot. It doesn't get too hot. It's not too expensive. It's kind of in the Goldilocks zone. But the Pi Zero is a little more extreme and, being really small and agile, and it doesn't have a lot of requirements. The Pi 4 is really the Cadillac of all these. So just looking at the power consumption, like when your Summit's on the air, you got a battery and a solar panel. You've got a power budget, okay? So the Raspberry Pi 4 at idle is 2.2 watts, okay? The Raspberry Pi Zero is a third of that. It 0.76 watts, okay? That's nothing. I mean, a light bulb, an LED light bulb is within that range. So it's just next to nothing to do the idle current just to operate this thing. And the Raspberry Pi 4 does get hot just sitting there being idle. So that's where a lot of that energy is going. So just to run Direwolf, this is going to be APRS, AX.25, packet BBS, that kind of workload. The Raspberry Pi 4 is drawing 2 watts at that point, and the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 wireless is drawing less than a watt. So again, more than double the power budget just to run Direwolf and packet workloads. Just to give you an idea of just the CPU workload, so the Raspberry Pi 4 running Direwolf, that burns about 6% of the total aggregate CPU availability. For the Raspberry Pi Zero, we're burning about 12% of the aggregate CPU availability. I think the difference there is they are different processors. Yeah, they're both quad-core, but the Raspberry Pi 4 is running at 1.4 gigahertz. Raspberry Pi Zero 2 wireless is running at 1 gigahertz, so it has a slower clock. That's probably why it has a little less performance and probably a lot less heat dissipation. Just for reference here, the original Raspberry Pi Zero, the old one that we're not really talking about today, but is great for APRS type packet stuff, that's burning 17% of that CPU. That is a single core CPU. So Direwolf is really efficient at doing the sound modem, 1200 baud sound modem stuff. Okay, getting past packet, getting into the cool HF applications. That's WSJTX, FLDigi, JS8 call. So running WSJTX, FT8 mode, which is what we're just doing here. That's running 3.2 watts, okay, on the Pi 4. And then at a fraction of that, less than half, the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 wireless is basically doing the same thing at less than half the power. Okay, FLDigi at JS8 call have very similar stories. Okay, FLDigi is running at 3 watts and 1.6 watts on the Pi Zero. JS8 call, very similar, 3 watts versus 1.8. What's important about FLDigi and JS8 call, which makes these interesting, is FLDigi will not fit in the 512 megabyte RAM footprint that is available to you on the Raspberry Pi Zero. It simply will not run. It'll run out of memory. Now, if you're using the DigiPi image, that's not a problem because I actually steal graphics memory and give that over to system memory so that FLDigi actually fits in the physical memory of the Raspberry Pi Zero. On a different Raspberry Pi, you might have to add a swap file or something. I really wouldn't recommend swapping through on an SD card. But anyways, the DigiPi gets around the RAM, the 512 megabyte RAM requirement. If you want to run this as a full-blown desktop, like you want to have a web browser, maybe a text editor and a clock, and want to run JS8 call, that ain't going to work in 512 megabytes. It's just not, okay? DigiPi is a little different in that it runs one application at a time and runs it really well, and it doesn't run anything else really concurrently, so there's no competition for resources in the system. The Raspberry Pi 4, on the other hand, if you want a full-blown desktop, this could replace your PC in a lot of cases. You can run anything on this. This is a 4 gigabyte, so 8 times the amount of memory in the Raspberry Pi 4. Not to mention the extreme I/O capability. So this has USB 3.0 in it, which is a full-speed disk drive. You can hook up a full-speed USB 3 disk drive to this, and it's just fantastic. It's so much faster than the SD card. So if you have high I/O requirements, want to make your NAS, maybe a movie file server or something, the Raspberry Pi 4 is really the only choice. But let's drag this back to amateur radio, okay? I said FLDigi really needs more than 512 megabytes. We can fake it on the DigiPi, no problem, by doing some tricks there, but don't expect it to work on the Pi Zero out of the box. JS8 call, on the other hand, needs more CPU. So on the old Raspberry Pi Zero, JS8 call will simply fail. It's going to lock up with CPU problems, okay? Both the Raspberry Pi Zero 2 wireless and the Pi 4 have no problems with CPU on JS8 call, so that constraint is gone on both of these guys. And then we get into the more aesthetics on these. So the weight on the Pi 4 is 114 grams, and again, this is for you guys climbing summits. The weight on the Pi Zero 2 wireless is going to be 35 grams, so again, a fraction of the weight. The boot time on these, I was kind of interested in this. How long does it take each one of these to boot from when you power them on? It's the same. It's 48 seconds on both of these, at least for the DigiPi image. And the reason that is because it's all waiting on that SD card. So maybe if you get a faster SD card, you can reduce that boot time if that's important to you, but you're not going to see a faster boot time on the Pi 4 versus Pi Zero 2 wireless. And then that brings me to one of the biggest differences, which is the thermal capabilities of these. So the Raspberry Pi 4 really needs some sort of thermal solution. It just gets too hot. And once it hits like 70 Celsius or so, it'll start throttling and it's going to drop that CPU frequency and the performance is going to degrade.
The Pi Zero, on the other hand, you can actually run it without a heatsink. It will get hot, but it won't hit that limiter. Okay, so I do have I almost hate to mention, just like a trivial heatsink. You can't really see it; it's under that screen. Just to take a little heat off. Plus, it's in a plastic case, so this is like the worst case in heat scenario for the Pi Zero2 wireless. And I could actually get this up to 66 centigrade, running torture tests, but you're not running torture tests. You're just running some ham radio apps. So, during normal application workload, it's going to be down in the 45, maybe 50, and that's even in this plastic case. Okay, the Raspberry Pi 4 running torture tests, that's burning all 4 CPUs and just allocating memory over and over. I could get it up to 52 centigrade with this radiator with no fan. So I was actually pretty pleased with all of that. I'm really happy with both of these Pis. I'll definitely use them. Raspberry Pi Zero I will use for Summit on the air, I'm sure. And the Raspberry 4 is probably going to stay here with me in the shack. And they are both going to be running the DigiPi image so we can continue to do amateur radio stuff as easy as possible. In fact, we just got a contact. Let's check this out. We got KA4TAR. Thank you for the contact on WSJTX FT8. And that's running on the Raspberry Pi 4. So we know it's possible, and that's hooked up to the ICOM 705 on HF. All right, guys. Hey, thanks for hanging out with me, doing comparing and contrasting the Pi Zero2 wireless and the Pi 4. I think this is a lot of fun. I'm into computers, obviously, so I'm kind of fascinated exactly what we can get out of these things. They're so cheap, they're so powerful, and they're just so perfect for amateur radio, for every data mode you can think of especially that you get on the DigiPi. And then they're all listed here. And then remember Krager.org. You get access to the DigiPi. This goes to patrons of the channel. Where are you guys? You guys make this possible. Thank you, patrons. Man, I appreciate it. You make the DigiPi possible. So patreon.com/KM6LYW. Foo, Steve, and we'll just say Mark. I always see your call sign. Ryan, Brian, Jake, Chris, Jim, Tony, Malcolm. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. I wish I could read all your names, but it's insane now, the support here. I'm getting email from a lot of you. We're talking about some really cool stuff on Discord. We've got a Google group to talk about DigiPi, and not just DigiPi, but all digital modes, really getting the most out of your amateur radio. You spend $1,000 on one of these radios, right? And what do you get? Maybe an RTTY decoder? No. There's so much more you can do with the Raspberry Pi. It really makes your amateur radio shine. So if you're going to make the investment for $1,000 HF rig, go ahead and get a $55 Raspberry Pi, if you can get it, or a $15 Raspberry Pi, and get access to all of those digital modes available to you in your web browser over Wi-Fi or your phone or wireless device. So do that, and let's talk on amateur radio using digital modes. Hey guys, I'm going to get out of here. My name is Craig, call sign KM6LYW, and I am clear.